Welcome, everyone, to Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia. We are joined today by Dr. Chris Knobbe, who's been on the show before. We were trying to figure out how long it's been, and it's been a while, Chris.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks for having me on, Phil and Jack. It's great to be back.
do a
Appreciate
quick reintroduction for those folks who were um, foolish enough to have not heard you before.
it. All right. I'm a physician. I specialized in ophthalmology and I really turned into a nutrition researcher about right at a decade ago. After putting in pretty much a full career in ophthalmology, I left ophthalmology to pursue nutrition research when a few changes in my diet made a huge difference in my arthritis. And anyway, so I started going down this path then, and I started with the work of Lauren Cordain, and I eventually came to the work of Weston A. Price back in 2013, and I developed a hypothesis that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50. So I pursued that and actually left practice to pursue that full time back in 2015. And in about 2018, 2019, I really started coming back to focus on processed foods and vegetable oils as drivers, as the main drivers of overweight, obesity, and almost all chronic disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, cancers, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, macular degeneration, the list goes on. And so that's where I've been for about the last 6 years. My work's really been focused on broadly on all of that, essentially. So that's the quick recap.
Yeah, and I think last time we had you on the book that you wrote, which people can actually see over my shoulder there on the
Yeah.
bookshelf because it is one of my go-tos, the Ancestral Diet Revolution. And I think you had just released a book when we had you on last, and we talked some about it. But um, let's first talk about, so you just mentioned, right, this sort of awakening that occurred, this, one of the diseases that you were spending a lot of time treating, macular degeneration, AMD. um, you Something kind of tipped you off to the fact that it wasn't what you had been educated it was, and what was causing it was different. And of course, I've come to a similar realization around heart disease, and I've spoken to the diabetes doctors who have come to the different realization around that. And, the list goes on, like you said. But maybe talk a little bit about what was the first inkling maybe that you had that, AMD, you're seeing it every day, you're treating it by a certain paradigm, you had an understanding about what was supposedly causing it, and what was it that kind of got you thinking, maybe we don't quite understand this?
Yeah, good question, Phil. So being trained in an allopathic medical institution here in Colorado, the University of Colorado, I went through residency, ophthalmology residency back in 91 to 94, and I really it wasn't until it was many years later, about 20 years later, that after I began to understand that processed foods and uh, I'd just say particularly maybe sugars and vegetable oils are drivers of all of obesity and all this chronic disease. It just occurred to me that given the name age-related macular degeneration, that this might be another degenerative disease that had always stuck in my head, that Weston Price's work back in the 1930s was generally connected processed foods and degenerative disorders. And I just thought, that's what we see in the macula is degeneration. And But what we've been taught is that AMD is a disease of aging and genetics almost exclusively, and that there really wasn't anything you could do to prevent it. And if you developed it, all you could do is take these supplemental vitamins, ARIDS formula vitamins, and good luck, because the results are not very good no matter what you do. I mean, in the allopathic pathway. And so again, this hit me in mid or late 2013, I thought, well, if AMD was or is a disease of processed foods, then it should have been rare, when we didn't have any processed food. So that's what I did. I started there, Phil, and I started working on that. And it took many months to dig into this literature. I ended up with this small library of 19th century textbooks and early 20th century textbooks and scientific papers. And because there was nobody, almost no one had done any work on the history of the disease. And what I discovered was that between 1851, when AMD was first discoverable, and about 1930, there were no more than about 50 cases of AMD in all the world's literature. And there weren't really,
Whoa, 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 whoa. Say that again?
yeah, no more than 50 cases of AMD in all the world's literature. I published this in our first paper on this back in 2017 in the journal Medical Hypotheses. Just to put that in perspective, in 2020, it was estimated there was 196 million cases of AMD, and there's expected to be 288 million by 2040. And so I knew that with this disease being rare, the same as coronary heart disease, that there's, has to be an environmental factor. So what is that? And I was really new to all this, but I knew that we could track processed foods by sugar and vegetable oil consumption. So that's what we did. So we analyzed data in 25 nations, and in every single nation, what we saw was as the sugar and vegetable oils go up, the prevalence of AMD went up, and they went up in parallel, essentially. And in those South Pacific islands where they had almost no vegetable oils, the AMD incidence was rare. So that's what, so we published that paper, me and one other nutrition researcher and I worked with a few ophthalmologists in the South Pacific that helped us with establishing the prevalence of AMD in some of those islands. And anyway, so we published that, and it just pretty much has fallen flat on when it comes to the ophthalmology community. They have no interest in this so far. We need to publish a few more papers, and that's my fault. But I've been working on, like I said, on so much of all the other chronic diseases and so forth. So we've got a lot we need to get published, but yeah, it's just not been heard. And I've never been on the stages of any big ophthalmology conferences. I figured I would be on stages presenting this at the American Academy of Ophthalmology, and we submitted multiple times, me and multiple colleagues. Worked with 17 colleagues, ophthalmologists, retina specialists, of some statisticians, mathematicians, and so forth, working on all that data. And they don't, so we applied for multiple to present this data at multiple conferences. We've been turned down multiple times. So I don't even try anymore.
So
Yeah, it's just
I'm
amazing.
puzzled. When somebody who's a diabetes researcher shows an incontrovertible link between the consumption of sugar and the incidence of diabetes, it doesn't surprise me when the American Diabetes Association isn't interested, because they get major money from big pharma.
Mm-hmm.
are there drugs that are designed to treat AMD, and there's a financial incentive to not pay attention to this information like there is with diabetes? And
Yes.
I'm not a doctor, so I have no problem saying this. I'm not risking a license to say, hey, the American Diabetes Association doesn't want you to get well. But ophthalmology is the same way?
I really don't. Well, absolutely, there are drugs. There are injectable drugs for, there's been injectable drugs for wet AMD, the more advanced type, for since 2005. But and even more recently now, there's drugs that at least one drug that's an injectable for dry AMD, so the earlier form. But the but again, it's like heart attacks and strokes. We need to prevent AMD. That's the only way to really prevent moderate or severe vision loss, is to prevent the disease, or at least prevent the progression. And by the way, since I went public with this back in 2016 and came out with a book and a paper in 2017, we've literally had hundreds of people stay in touch with me that went on an ancestral diet, got rid of vegetable oils, and just got rid of processed foods in general. Literally hundreds of people, including many physicians, who have told me their macular degeneration has completely stabilized since they went on an ancestral diet. Again, we've got case reports, but lots of them going back about 8, 9 years now.
Let me I'm going to put on my skeptic hat for a minute and just kind of ask you, how confident are you in this association? And I'm going to frame it in, much of my audience knows the story behind, how this went in heart disease, right? And there was this same sort of alarm about the, rapidly increasing incidence of heart disease in the 1950s. And along comes Ansel Keys, and he puts out his 7 countries study, and says, look, saturated fat consumption and heart disease, they line up perfectly, and it's got to be the saturated fat. And obviously, we now know, that's not true. But some people might be sitting here as thinking, well, how do we know that Chris isn't pulling the same thing that Ansel Keys did, and kind of fudging this data, or the data isn't really as strong as it might appear to be. So what's your how would you kind of answer that from a skeptic?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, and I have to be a skeptic all the time, looking at my own work, to be sure that it's all, it's truly authentic, and it holds water, and it'll stand the test of time. But I'd say, I mean, there's an incredibly long answer to this, Phil. But I will say, and I don't really know how to I don't know how to tackle this, given that the subject is so fantastically, huge. But I'll tell you this, that first of all, I think that when it comes to establishing causality between any food component and obesity and all the chronic diseases, from coronary heart disease to AMD, almost all of these, we're going to have to rely heavily on retrospective observational epidemiologic data. And I say that because we're, as you know, we don't have any randomized controlled trials that have proven to us what causes coronary heart disease, right? They've looked at, there's been a number of studies that have looked at, saturated fat versus vegetable oils and coronary heart disease. And I mean, in general, the answer is most of them don't, they are about the same, right? And in general, there would be more cancers in the groups that were put on the vegetable oils. But again, we don't have any answers from those studies, because they're first of all, they're poorly constructed. they're way too short, and there's just so many variables, confounding variables that they couldn't possibly control for. And so I'll say, for example, like the American veterans, uh, um, the LA American Veterans Trial, I think it was 8 years, right? And there is people going in and out of the study, and they tried to keep one group on a higher saturated fat diet and one group on vegetable oil diet, and at the end of that study, the results were kind of similar in terms of the coronary heart disease deaths, but and there was higher deaths in the vegetable oil group, but they didn't have any answers. Now, here's the thing: there's so many problems with this. So first of all, if you're going to completely control diets in people, you need to put them into a metabolic ward and control everything they eat, and analyze everything that all of the food, um, and measure all of it that's consumed. And the people cannot leave the metabolic ward because they can go to McDonald's and eat a hamburger and French fries and a Coke, and now your study is ruined, at least for that subject. So um, so if in these scenarios, you need to have the longest studies I've ever seen, Phil, are about 6 months of people being in a metabolic ward because they're prisoners of the ward. They literally cannot leave, right? And so if we think about this, it kind of, all of the other studies, they don't have very good control of what the people are eating, and they're too short. If you think about the incubation period of all of these diseases, coronary heart disease, stroke, probably many cancers, and certainly Alzheimer's and dementia and macular degeneration, the incubation period for these diseases is typically 4 decades and up, right? And
Yeah.
and then you have the issue that when you consume seed oils or any fatty acids, the fatty acids are ultimately reflected in your body fat, and which means in your cell membranes and in your inner mitochondrial membranes and on and on. That those fatty acids are reflected based on what you've consumed over the past 3 years. So if you're going to compare a high vegetable oil diet and a zero vegetable oil diet, you need to, first of all, put both groups on an ancestral diet, no vegetable oils, virtually no nuts or seeds, no high omega-6 foods, for 3 years. And then they'll all have a low body fat omega-6. They'll all be at 3% or under. Then you start the study. So that's already a 3-year washout period. You start the study, put the one group on high vegetable oil diet, another group on high saturated fat, or whatever, just a normal fat diet, but all natural fat. Then you start the study. Well, if you're going to get results on coronary heart disease, you probably need to run the study for 4 decades. So, and they need to be in a metabolic ward. So you need to make these people prisoners for decades. This is not true of some, metabolic syndrome and diabetes. You could produce those quickly, like within a matter of months or maybe a couple of years, but you can't do that with coronary heart disease or diabetes, dementia or something like that. And so there are no good studies. So we have to rely on observational
Well, hold
epidemiologic.
on. I want to pause right there.
Sure.
There are no good studies. That's a, I appreciate the humility involved in being able to make a statement like that. Um, this is one of the places where I've realized most humans who are not trained as scientists and not trained as logicians or statisticians get really confused. They assume because the New York Times does a story on somebody who published a research paper in a prestigious journal that may or may not reference another such type of thing with a chain that may go back 15 layers of this kind of thing, that at the root of it, there's really not good, solid, controlled research. All we're doing is saying it looks like, if we do more of this, we get more of that. And if we do less of this, we get less of that. But 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 there's not settled science here.
Hmm.
I just
Right.
I appreciate the humility.
Yeah, so really what I'm ultimately driving at here, guys, is that, we're not going to get, we don't have, and we're never going to have randomized controlled clinical trials to establish what's driving this. And so this is why I focused, for the most part, for a decade on observational epidemiologic evidence, because I've got data, we've got evidence going clear back to the mid 19th century. And I've got that evidence for the food supply too. And it's that the best evidence in the entire world is in the United States. And we've got, we've got extremely good evidence after 1909. And so when you take that and then you look at it in comparison to in or relative to the development of all these diseases, then I think you have something really, really powerful and something that otherwise is never going to be achieved. I mean, there's been this belief system, and I don't really know where it came from, but I think it's born out of big pharma that we can't figure out anything if we don't have a randomized controlled trial.
Right.
And that's just not true. I would say to you, or to the audience, just to make us think, do you believe that smoking causes lung cancer and death? And everybody's going to say, sure, and we all know, well, what the evidence shows that smoking increased lung cancer by 15 to 30 fold. But we didn't randomize, we didn't take two
Yeah.
groups of, 1,000 13-year-old children and randomize 1,000 of them to smoke for 50 years, another 1,000 not to smoke for 50 years. And you can't do it. It's impractical and it's unethical. And so how did we establish that smoking causes lung cancer? We established this through observational epidemiologic evidence. We connected all this. And this is what I do. And I know that, when we look at the whole population as a whole, I don't know individually who's consuming what, but I know in general that, we went from zero, for example, zero vegetable oil consumption in 1865 to 9 grams per person per day in 1909 to 19 grams by 1960 to 80 grams per person per day by 2010. And during that period, obesity went from 1.2% to 42.5%. Diabetes climbed from 0.0028% in 1890 to 13% by 2016. And now I just saw data recently that it's up over 15%, which means that diabetes increased more than 5,600 fold between 1890 and about 2021. If it had doubled, that would be statistically significant. Coronary heart disease, an extreme rarity in the 19th century, became the leading cause of death in the 1930s. But by then, vegetable oil consumption was, 12 to 14 grams per person per day, and people were smoking more. So all of these things seem to run together, and everywhere I've looked, when if we're trying to answer this question about causality, um, the correlation is powerful. If we look at Bradford Hill's 9 criteria to establish or to infer causality, the number one criterion was strength of evidence or strength of association. And strength of association really is another way of saying correlation. And you can put that into a number, the correlation coefficient. And so we've looked at this. And for example, I'll just give you a couple of numbers. So if you look at, the entire history of vegetable oil and sugar consumption in the United States versus obesity, there's an extremely high correlation with obesity. It's something like 0.98. 1.0 would be perfect correlation. you have a substantially lower correlation. It's may still maybe 0.7 or zero point 0.8. I can't remember these numbers right off the top of my head. But we've looked at, for example, regression analysis that looks at that all of these, how these are all moving um, independently and together. And the regression analysis shows that if you fully account for vegetable oil consumption as a driver of obesity, that sugar has no is not a driver at all. It has no effect whatsoever, or no known effect. If you look at this as a two-factor model, in other words, you're just saying
Okay,
only vegetable oil and sugar could be drivers.
let me make sure I understand what you said. If you take sugar out of the equation, the results are the same. If you take vegetable oil out of the results with obesity don't change. But if you take vegetable oil out and leave sugar, you get a radically different correlation. Is that right?
Well, I don't know that you could say that because you don't know what for sure what happens with if you took the sugar out, because that's sort of a counterfactual. We don't really know that. We'd love to know, but but if you look at how they're if you look at so regression analysis tries to establish which of a number of things could be drivers, which is most
Oh,
connected to the movement of two variables, moving together. And so basically all I can tell you, Jack, is that if you fully account for the effect of vegetable oils on obesity and diabetes, that in the United States, there is no known effect of sugar. It has no power it is no known power that, in other words, vegetable oil appears to be the sole driver, but that's a two-factor regression model, meaning we're only looking at vegetable oil and sugar because there's other drivers. I'm not saying
sure.
that I believe vegetable oil is the only driver of obesity. People got obese before we ever had vegetable oils and processed foods, and you can become obese for other reasons. I'm not saying, but I do believe that vegetable oils might account for 90% of obesity in the United States, and I think it's much higher as a cause of diabetes. I think it could be 96% or maybe higher for diabetes.
And along those lines, the AMD that you're seeing, right? Is it uh I guess is it sort of an independent disease, or is it occurring along with the diabetes and the metabolic syndrome? And how much are you seeing people
Yeah.
that I guess are not diabetic, or don't have obesity and don't have these other obvious metabolic diseases that are getting AMD? You think AMD is kind of there's some perhaps unique association between vegetable oils and AMD that's kind of independent of the metabolic effects of the vegetable oils?
I think, um, to the best of my knowledge, Phil, I think that, well, first of all, we know that AMD is strongly connected to obesity. And because and obesity is obviously strongly linked to associated with metabolic syndrome and diabetes, of course. Diabetes, interestingly, seems to have sort of a little bit of a protective factor with AMD. In other words, it seems like when people get diabetes, they don't get as much AMD. And
Huh.
I don't know
Interesting.
why that is, but I do know that I believe that a big part of AMD is the mitochondrial dysfunction. The fact that like all of these diseases are connected by mitochondrial dysfunction, right? And it's the same way in the eye, and the retina, the macula particularly is fantastically has an extraordinary um, energy usage. Like those are the most. I think there's something like there's substantially more more of an energy user than even heart muscle, for example. And but I think they all do tend to run together.
Yeah.
That's a definite.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just, and again, the power of all this in my mind, right? The power of talking about metabolic health is, I can be a heart surgeon talking about metabolic health as a, preventative strategy for heart disease. But I also know, right, that when you improve your metabolic health, you're going to, improve your diabetes and lower your risk of cancer and, lower your risk of AMD. Whereas, if I'm just a heart doctor saying lower your cholesterol because it lowers your risk of heart disease, whether or not that's actually true, but even if it is true, no one talks about lowering cholesterol as affecting your diabetes risk or affecting your AMD risk or your cancer risk. So, this metabolic approach just seems more powerful in the end because I hear all of these different medical specialties talking about it. And you start looking at AMD, and I start looking at heart disease, and Jason Fung is looking at kidney disease, and somehow we all arrive at the same place. Like that really grabs your attention as maybe this is something that we should be looking at more strongly.
Right. Yeah. If I could, guys, can I give you some I want to give you some interesting data on sugar and vegetable oil versus obesity in the United States. Is that okay?
Yeah,
We
that would
love
be
that.
great.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to I ran some data here, and I could show you this graph if you want, or I can just give the numbers. But between so sugar has gone up, tremendously for centuries in the United States, but most of the increase, probably 80% of the increase occurred before 1922, and that's what people don't realize.
The
And
increase of sugar consumption.
yeah, the bulk, so around 80% of the total increase in sugar, like for example, between 1822 and 1999, sugar consumption in the US went up 17-fold. Went up, from 6 pounds per person per year to 108 pounds per person per year. But the huge bulk of that had already, increased by 1922. So I picked out a period of time between 1922 and 1987. It's 65-year period, when sugar was almost completely flat. I'm going to give you the numbers. But so in 1922, sugar consumption, this is in the US, was 473 calories per person per day. By 1987, it was 497 calories. So 24 calories more, 5% more flat. It's virtually, it's a sawtooth pattern, but it's flat, right? The same time, 1922 to 1987, vegetable oil increased from 78 calories to 550 calories. So it went up more than sevenfold. During that time, obesity increased from 2.95% to 18.6%. So it went up 6.3-fold. So let me just give you those numbers quickly, just to make it all fit together. In a 65-year period between 1922 and 1987, sugar increased 5%, vegetable oils increased 605%, obesity increased 532%. So for sugar theorists, this is a 65-year period of time, sugar didn't change. It's flat, but vegetable oils went up 605%. And obesity increased 532%. So what would they say to this?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, the way that I've started to think about this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is, the vegetable and seed oils seem to be what damages, the cellular machinery.
Yes.
And then once that occurs, the sugar becomes problematic, right? Because our body can no longer process all the sugar that's coming in. And so that's the way that I've come to think about it and put all this information together. And in the end, right, it almost becomes a moot point because sugar and vegetable oil consumption is so tightly linked in our country, right? It's all coming in the processed food essentially. And so, eliminating one is going to eliminate the other for the most part. But, again, I now talk to people about, it seems like the vegetable and seed oils are what really cause the damage. But once we have that damage done, we can no longer tolerate sugar and processed carbohydrates.
I could not agree more. That's exactly what I think, Phil. Yeah, I think I've said, since 2016 when I first started going public with my work, I've said, it all boils down to mostly to three things. For the at a public level, it's refined flours, refined sugars, and vegetable oils. Those are the big things. As a public health advocate, those are the things I would suggest everybody try to get rid of. But I think they should try to get rid of all vegetable oils, really. I mean, there are vegetable oils that are fine, like the highly saturated ones, for example, like coconut oil, palm kernel oil. Those would be perfectly fine, and probably olive oil is fine while we're on the topic. But all of the seed oils, soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, and peanut oils, peanut and sesame oils, all those are high omega-6 oils that I think we should just try to get rid of completely. And then, and I've never been able to find a country, and I don't think, or even a population that just consumed high sugar and no vegetable oils. I've
Yeah.
never seen one. They, like you just said, Phil, they just run together, but there is interest. So we've got data, I think, in something like 35 nations now, and in every single one of these, we see this trend, the vegetable oil going up, and usually the sugar goes up typically kind of along with it. But in all cases, obesity is going up and diabetes are going up with this. And I was looking for the counterfactual. What would be if you took it away, or if you never had it. Now there's so few of those, but I found one last year. France had vegetable oil going down since in about the last 20 years or so. And I thought, oh, I got to find out, what's happening with their obesity and their diabetes. And they're both going down, at least and then there's different reports. But based on, I think it's a World Obesity Report or whatever, their obesity is going down, and definitely their diabetes went down. So it's going down with it, along with the drop in the vegetable oil consumption. And if you look at the other counterfactual to this high vegetable oil, consumers, that would be like Vietnam. Vietnam has one of the lowest vegetable oil consumptions in the world. I think they were the number 2 or 4 or something like this, lowest in the world. And what was their obesity? It's 2%. Or it was recently, something like 2 or 3%. So,
And that's fascinating because I know that as a rule, Asia consumes a very high carbohydrate diet.
oh yes, very high.
That's a really, to me, that's a pretty strong counterfactual.
What do you mean? No, I'm saying their vegetable oil consumption was really low. Yeah, I didn't
Well,
say
yeah,
anything.
that's my point. They have a high carb diet, but low
Absolutely.
vegetable oil and low obesity. So
Yes.
that's strong.
Yeah,
That's
Yeah.
really
all
strong.
all of Asia was very high carb consumers. Like, we've got really good data for Japan. They were consuming in 1960, they were consuming 84% carbohydrate. On mainland Japan, that's all white rice. And then the rest of their diet was traditionally made up of fish and vegetables. So very small amount though. So, but they're 84% carbohydrate. And over the next 4 decades, from 1960 to about 2004, their carbohydrate dropped down to 56%. And their calories went down by almost a third, from about 2,900 calories per day down to like 1,900 roughly. Their sugar was dropping after 2000 or after 1989. So while their total calories, their carbohydrate, and their sugar were all going down, the one thing that was going up was vegetable oils. They went from 9 grams per person per day in 1960 to 39 grams per person per day by 2004. So it went up 4.5 fold. And during this time, guys, the obesity in the men doubled, went from 16% to 32% just during this period. A very short window of that period too, like maybe 20 years or so. But obesity in the men doubled. Breast cancer in the women was up 5-fold. Diabetes increased 345-fold between 1954 and I think 2010, roughly, but a 345-fold increase in their diabetes from 0.02% in 1954 to I think it was around close to 7% in the early 2000s. And their macular degeneration went up 82-fold from 0.2% in the late 1970s to 16.37%, I believe it was, by 2013. So while it's like calories, carbohydrates, sugar, all going down. One thing was going up is the vegetable oils and their omega-6 increased about 7-fold, and obesity doubles in men, breast cancer up 5-fold, diabetes up 345-fold, macular degeneration up 82-fold.
Are
Wow.
you optimistic that we're going to start to see vegetable and seed oil consumption go down? As we're recording this, we've had two national food chains that I'm aware of that have announced now that they're going to eliminate seed oils. And there at least seems to be more discussion about this. What how are you reading the trends, and are you optimistic?
Yeah, well, with RFK Jr. At the helm of this, if that all works out, I think that I think the nation's going to learn that vegetable oils maybe, I'm not sure what the message will be, but at least that they could be dangerous, or maybe that they are dangerous. I know RFK Jr. is convinced that they're dangerous. I wish I could work with him on this, but I have not had that opportunity, hasn't presented at all. But anyway, yeah, I'm optimistic, Phil. I think that it seems like when I first began presenting on this back in 2016, I felt like I was, just a loner. Like nobody was talking about vegetable oils except for Kate Shanahan was the only one I knew of that had really been talking and publishing on the dangers of vegetable oil. And now, my 26-year-old daughter and her friends all, her friends have learned it not from me, they've kind of gotten it through the grapevine. And so, my daughter says people really tend to know about this a lot more now. I think the Seed Oil Scout, that app that allows you to track or find restaurants that are low in seed oils. I think things like this are opening the eyes of people. And so yeah, I'm excited. I feel like it's, we're making progress.
I'm not I'm not an advocate for anything here. This is a question that occurred to me. I know that an awful lot of seed oils began life as industrial lubricants.
Mhm.
And um, the question that occurs to me, is it the actual oil itself that is the problem, or is it the process that turns them into something that doesn't stink, that isn't cloudy, and that is not terribly viscous. The all the post all the all the processing that occurs to get it to a product that looks nice in a plastic bottle on a grocery store shelf. Is it, or
Yeah,
do we know?
I think it's both. I really think it's both because I think the high omega-6 is a problem. And I'm mostly convinced of this because I've known of a couple of people that tried to make their diets out of nuts. That was their protein source. And they were told to completely, one was told by her physician to completely avoid all animal fat. And so she was trying to get all of her all of her fat and a lot of her protein, trying to get it from nuts. And she became extremely sick. And I don't know if this is entirely from, omega-6, but she became extremely sick. She had a rapid progression of her carotid arterial disease.
Oh my
I
God.
don't know if and she was only in her 40s, but it progressed rapidly. And and so I mean that's just one case report, and I've heard a couple of these that were similar in like that. But also nuts are very, very high in oxalate and oxalic acid or oxalates, and so that also could be a factor there. But back to the question. So there's no vegetable oils are just not, for the most part, they're really not natural, and they're if you look at all of the ancestral diets, they're all under about 2% of the total calories is omega-6. And we were consuming in 2008, we were consuming 11.8% omega-6 linoleic acid in
So almost six
2008.
times higher.
Yeah, 6 times higher, roughly. Yeah. We were at only, but we modeled the diet in 1865 when there was no seed oils and all naturally raised foods, and people were only consuming about 1.1% omega-6 linoleic acid in 1865. That's what we estimate. So if we went from 1.1% to 11.8%, we're looking at roughly 11-fold increase. So 1,000% increase. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it, Jack, is when you heat vegetable oils and these high omega-6s, because they're unsaturated, they're going to oxidize, and that produces the advanced lipid oxidation end products. That's where you get 4-HNE, 4-hydroxynonenal, malondialdehyde, carboxyethylpyrrole, acrolein, and there's literally hundreds of others they don't have names for, right? And these are collectively really dangerous. They're cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, obesogenic, and diabetogenic. You can tell I've said
Put all of that in English for me.
They're
that.
not good.
They're
That's the English.
they're not good. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. They're well, carcinogenic, mutagenic, that's gonna
Carcinogenic, I understand what that means.
so carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, causing clots, um,
Ah,
um, cytotoxic, toxic to cells in general, um, atherogenic, causing atherosclerosis, obesogenic, driving obesity, diabetogenic, causing driving diabetes.
I guess those two. Very good.
Yeah. So, let's see what else.
Okay.
Leave something out.
The English version is don't put that stuff in your body. It's it's not just bad, it's actively poisonous and toxic.
Yes. Yes.
What
So,
action did you take as a result of discovering this, and what has been your personal experience?
You mean after discovering the dangers of vegetable oils?
Yeah.
For me, I don't think it was much of a factor because I had, even though I didn't know what I was doing and I did a lot of things wrong, the one thing that we pretty much always did is we made our own food. And I so just naturally I avoided a lot of I did a lot of stupid things. Don't get me wrong. But I and made a lot of mistakes, but I didn't have a much in the way of vegetable oils in my diet. So I don't think that was ever
You didn't have
much
to
of a
make
factor.
significant changes.
Not well, yeah, I think I have. I mean, I really cleaned up my diet because before 2011, I didn't really know what an ancestral diet was. I didn't know what I didn't know what processed foods were really. I didn't know anything about nutrition. And so I really cleaned up my diet and I know um, I'm a lot more attentive to now that I understand that I need to get all these various nutrients, the vitamins and the minerals, and I'm very tuned into trying to make my diet densely nutritious, particularly with the minerals. And so that's been a big change. I really learned that the value of fruits and vegetables is mostly in the minerals. That it's just really hard to get calcium, magnesium, potassium, and copper out of meat. You can get copper out of organ meat, like liver is the best source of copper there is. But to try to get, if like for example, if you're on like a carnivore diet, it's going to be really hard to get calcium, magnesium, and potassium in sufficient amounts to meet your needs. And I think this is why, I mean, I've known a number of people that had a lot of troubles on carnivore. I'm just pointing out carnivore because it's trending, and I know and I've even tried carnivore. I think it's a good elimination diet. But I
Yeah.
think long term, I see parallels between like vegan, you can't get your fat soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2. Well, you can get the D from the sun, but you can't, it's going to be really hard to get your A and K2 on a vegan diet, for example, and other things. You can't get any B12 unless you supplement, right? But I'm saying in general, that's their problem. They're going to have trouble getting A and K2. I think at the other extreme, if you go to carnivore, and you don't have any plant foods at all, then it's going to be really hard to get your calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And you'll get your copper as long as you're eating something like liver. But if you don't have organ meats like liver, you're going to suffer with your copper deficiency too. Now, it may take 3 or 5 years to hit, but I've known a number of people that had these kind of trouble, and they started having issues like muscle spasms and palpitations and trouble sleeping and I hair falling out and low thyroid and low T3, all these kinds of things on carnivore. So, um, but anyway, I might have went off on a tangent there, but that's
That's
just
okay.
my observations.
So it
We
sounds
like to
like,
have we like good
your
tangents.
yeah, your focus is nutrient balance, nutrient density, and then avoidance of vegetable seed oils, high omega 6s, whatever you want to, however
Yeah.
you want to look at that, right? I think a couple of different ways that you can look at it, but it basically comes down to eat real food and get the nutrients that your body needs, and that should minimize these chronic diseases that we're battling against.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I believe if we could eliminate vegetable oils, we could eliminate 90+% of our chronic disease right there in one fell swoop.
Well, yeah, we're certainly hoping that we at least get to, start that experiment. Like you said, there seem to be some forces lining up. And in the meantime, we both have the privilege of working with people who are doing this individually, and they're seeing great results from it. And I think that should speak louder than it does. Like you said, we've kind of gotten into this, trapped in this paradigm where if it's not done within a randomized controlled trial, it gets minimized. But, you really can't ignore the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that are doing this, and they're seeing great results from it.
Doing what, Phil?
Eliminating, processed food,
Oh
and
yeah.
paying attention to vegetable and seed oils, and all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, completely
what
agree.
is Ancestral Health Foundation? That's one of your websites. What
Yeah, well,
what's
yeah,
that all about?
that's a nonprofit organization, nonprofit entity that we what moving forward. So what we want to do is ultimately we want to do research on ancestrally living populations around the world, and maybe 5 or 6 population studies where we would look at the ancestrally living tribe, for example, and then evaluate them for all of this, well, most all of this chronic disease, and then also evaluate their diet. So evaluate, completely evaluate their food intake. And then go into the city to the urban area and evaluate their genetic cohorts and do the exact same thing, but evaluate them for evaluate them for coronary heart disease, for stroke, cancer, diabetes, metabolic disease, obesity, AMD, all of this and more, do the exact same thing on their genetic cohorts in the city. So basically like what Weston A. Price did, but in a 21st century version, where we also do all this, the analytics of the both the diets. And then the key thing would be to analyze their adipose for fatty acids in order to prove this omega-6 theory. So I say prove in single quotes here. To
Right.
prove this omega-6 theory, that because I know we're going to find a very, very low, and zero seed oil diet in the people completely living ancestrally, and then we're going to find a high seed oil diet on almost everyone that's urbanized, westernized, and but that would, and then so we could with all the data analytics, we could compare those populations. So what we'd like to do is 5 or 6 populations like this around the world, but we don't have the funding yet. Ancestral Health Foundation is the entity that we hope to operate this through. But these studies collectively will probably be in the $20 million range. There's the we'd need a lot of people, and we would need to do a whole lot of studies, and the nutritional analyses of the food is very expensive. So we'd have to do like duplicate plate analyses. So you basically that you whatever they make their plate of food, and you make a duplicate plate, and then you freeze that and send it in and have it completely analyzed and for all of its nutrients. And then you have to do a number of those. The more, obviously, the more you can do, the more robust would be your data set and your analyses. That would give you a very strong, would build a strong case. The more you can do, the better, basically.
Yeah. Well,
I've
amazing.
often wondered why there's not a home nutritional analysis kit. Um, you may
Yeah.
have just described why. Huh.
Yeah,
Amazing,
that's
amazing work that we certainly hope you're going to be able to bring to fruition. Where else can people connect with you and kind of follow along with what you're doing?
so my colleague Suzanne Alexander runs our Instagram. She likes us to send people there. That's Ancestral Health Foundation Instagram. And I do have a website, chrisknobe.com, and I'm soon going to be doing some of my own YouTube videos, which I've never done
Excellent.
before. So
Great.
I'm going to start trying to do a little bit of teaching, join you guys in helping to educate the world.
That's awesome. Yeah, we look forward to hearing more from you so we can continue to get this information spread, and keep up the great work that you've been doing.
Hey,
Thank you, Phil. I
Chris.
appreciate it.
Chris, before we started recording, you shared a chart with us. Is that something that would be available that we could make available on show notes? Have you got it somewhere that folks could actually download it and look at it?
Yeah, I can send you a whole bunch of them.
That might be worthwhile.
Huh?
Great.
That
Yeah,
might be
we'll add that.
worthwhile.
We'll add some of that stuff to the show notes and also point people to Chris's book that has so much of this data in it as well.
Good.
Again, the Ancestral Diet Revolution. Chris did I think, a masterful job in really pulling together the data, around this. So certainly want to point people towards that resource as well.
Thanks so much, Phil. I really appreciate that. It's an honor to be on your show, guys. I really appreciate it.
Well, I love chatting with you because you know your stuff. That's just I can't believe the statistics you just pull out of the air there. That I can't believe you know all that stuff. My brain isn't wired that way. I love it that there's people like you in the world who can track that stuff.
I I'm a data junkie.
A
Yeah,
data nerd. I'm gonna go.
yeah.
You're a full data nerd, is what you are.
Yeah,
But
I
you know what?
definitely am. I've looked at these
It's
numbers for so long, guys. It's like, eventually if you just keep, going through, you keep making graphs and looking at numbers, pretty soon they stick in your head.
well,
But
I think we've got some evidence in the government now that data nerds really can make the world better.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's the age of the data nerd.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, this has been the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast. Our guest has been Dr. Chris Knobbe. Please check out his book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, and all the other ways to contact him will be available in the show notes. We'll talk to y'all next time.